On Christmas night in 1943, 1,932 men died of hunger so cold it stopped their hearts within minutes. But one 17-year-old boy survived. And the strangest part of his story was not how he lived through that frozen hell. It was what happened after. Because the enemy who pulled him from the sea would save his life twice. Once from the Arctic's waters, and once from himself. This is the story of Klaus Hoffmann, a German sailor who became an American citizen, a prisoner of war who found love in Texas, and a man who spent 70 years learning that the people he was taught to hate were the ones who would show him what humanity truly means. But before we can understand how Klaus Hoffmann became an American, we must first go back to the night that killed nearly 2,000 of his shipmates. We must go back to the Battle of the North Cape. And we must understand what happens when two great warships meet in the darkness of the Arctic winter. Millbury, Ohio, December 2013. The snow falls quietly outside the window of a small house on Maple Street. Inside, an 87-year-old man sits in a worn leather armchair, watching the white flakes drift past the glass. His eyes are pale blue, faded by decades, but they still carry a sharpness that surprises anyone who looks closely enough. Klaus Hoffmann has lived in this house for 40 years. He raised two children here with his wife, Martha. He watched his grandchildren play in the backyard. He celebrated Thanksgivings and Christmases and 4th of Julys with neighbors who knew him simply as the quiet German man who worked at the machine shop downtown. Martha passed away 2 years ago. The house feels emptier now, quieter. The only sounds are the ticking of the grandfather clock and the soft whisper of the heating system pushing warm air through the vents. On the wall above the fireplace hang two photographs. One shows a massive warship cutting through gray seas, its guns pointed toward an invisible horizon. Beneath it in faded handwriting are the words Scharnhorst, 1943. The other photograph shows a Texas ranch house with a wooden fence stretching toward distant hills. That one reads McAllister Ranch, 1945. Two photographs, two worlds, and the 70 years between them contain a story that Klaus has told only one person in his entire life. The telephone rings. Klaus does not move immediately. At his age, he has learned that most phone calls bring bad news. Old friends passing away, medical appointments, solicitors trying to sell things he does not need. But something makes him reach for the receiver. A young voice speaks, British accent, polite but determined. Mr. Hoffmann, my name is James Crawford. I am writing about the Battle of the North Cape. I understand you were aboard the Scharnhorst. Klaus feels his heart stop, not from fear, from memory. The name Crawford is one he has not heard spoken aloud in decades, but it is a name that has echoed in his dreams for 70 years. What is your connection to Admiral William Crawford? There is a pause on the other end of the line. He was my grandfather. Klaus closes his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he sees it all again. The flash of star shells, the thunder of guns, the screaming of metal as shells tore through steel, and the cold, the terrible, impossible cold of the Arctic Sea. What do you want from me? I want to hear the real story, not from history books, from someone who lived through it. Klaus opens his eyes and looks at the two photographs on his wall. The warship that took him to hell, the ranch that brought him back to life. The real story does not begin with the battle. It begins with the smell of bacon, and it ends with the Texas girl who saved my soul. Altafjord, Norway, December 25th, 1943. The harbor lies shrouded in the perpetual darkness of Arctic winter. At this latitude, the sun does not rise for weeks at a time. The only light comes from the yellow glow of dock lamps reflecting off black water and the distant shimmer of stars in a frozen sky. In the center of the harbor rests a monster of steel and iron. The Scharnhorst stretches 235 meters from bow to stern. Her hull is painted in the dappled gray camouflage of the Kriegsmarine designed to blend with the North Atlantic seas. 3 massive gun turrets dominate her profile, each housing 3 28-centimeter guns capable of hurling shells weighing 330 kilograms over 40 kilometers. Her armor belt is 35 centimeters thick at its widest point, and her engines can push her through the water at 31 knots, making her one of the fastest battleships ever built. But statistics cannot capture what the Scharnhorst truly represents. She is a symbol, a reminder of German naval power in an age when that power is rapidly fading. She has sailed these waters for years, a constant threat to the Allied convoys carrying supplies to the Soviet Union. In 1940, she and her sister ship Gneisenau sank the British aircraft carrier Glorious, along with two escort destroyers. More than 1,500 British sailors died in those attacks. Among them was a young officer named Richard Crawford, the older brother of the man who would eventually sink the Scharnhorst. But on this Christmas night, the crew of the Scharnhorst knows nothing of the trap that awaits them. They know only that they have received orders from Berlin, orders that will send them into the darkness to hunt a convoy of merchant ships carrying weapons and food to the Russian front. Standing on the dock, watching his ship prepare for departure, is Admiral Ernst Richter. Richter is 60 years old. His hair has gone silver, cropped short in military fashion. His face is weathered by decades of salt wind and sleepless nights lined with deep creases around his eyes and mouth. He stands with the rigid posture of a career naval officer, but those who know him well can see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenches when he thinks no one is watching. Richter is not a battleship commander. His career was built in submarines where he earned a reputation as one of the most skilled U-boat captains in the early years of the war. But the previous commander of the Scharnhorst died suddenly of a heart attack 1 week ago, and Richter was transferred to take his place. 1 week. He has had 1 week to learn the names of his officers, 1 week to understand the capabilities of a ship he has never commanded, 1 week to prepare for a mission that every instinct tells him is suicide. Captain Werner Kolbe approaches with a telegram in his hand. Kolbe is younger than Richter, perhaps 45, with the eager efficiency of an officer still hoping for promotion. Orders from Naval High Command. Operation Ostfront. We sail tonight. Richter does not turn around. He continues staring at his ship. What is our target? Convoy JW-55B, 19 merchant vessels bound for Murmansk. Intelligence reports only light escort, 3 or 4 destroyers. And what does intelligence say about the position of the British home fleet? Kolbe hesitates, unable to determine, possibly at Scapa Flow. Richter finally turns. His eyes are cold, unable to determine. In my experience, Captain, those words mean only one thing. They mean our intelligence knows nothing. And when our intelligence knows nothing, it usually means the British know everything. Kolbe shifts uncomfortably. The orders come directly from Admiral Donitz. Refusal is not an option. Richter has already sent 3 telegrams to Berlin requesting postponement until better information is available. All 3 were denied. Hitler needs a victory. After the catastrophe at Stalingrad, after the grinding retreat on the Eastern Front, the Führer demands proof that German forces can still strike fear into the enemy. And the Scharnhorst, the last operational battleship of the Kriegsmarine, has been chosen as the instrument of that proof. Richter knows what Berlin does not understand. He knows that somewhere in the Arctic darkness, British warships are waiting. He can feel it in his bones, the instinct of a man who has survived 100 patrols in enemy waters. But he also knows what will happen if he refuses. The Gestapo will arrest him. His family will be investigated. Another officer will be found to take his place. And the Scharnhorst will sail anyway. At least this way he can try to bring his men home alive. Prepare for departure. But I want every watch station at maximum alert. No one sleeps tonight. In the crew quarters below decks, Klaus Hoffmann sits on his bunk writing a letter by the dim light of a single electric bulb. He is 17 years old. His face still carries the softness of youth cheeks that have not yet been weathered by years at sea. His hands are smooth, uncalloused, the hands of a boy who until 6 months ago had never been farther from home than the neighboring village. Klaus comes from Hamburg. His father worked at the Blom and Voss shipyard, the same shipyard where the Scharnhorst was built. When Klaus enlisted in the Navy, his father had placed both hands on his shoulders and said words that still echo in his memory. You will serve on the ship I helped to build. Make me proud. But tonight, sitting in the cramped quarters with nearly 2,000 other men, Klaus does not feel proud. He feels afraid. Around him, the veterans are whispering. They speak in low voices about bad omens. Sailing on Christmas night. No information about the enemy. A new commander who has never led a battleship into combat. Who are you writing to? Klaus looks up. Otto Weber has settled onto the bunk beside him. Otto is 35, a machinist from Munich, who has been aboard the Scharnhorst since her commissioning. He has taken Klaus under his wing these past months, teaching him the rhythms of shipboard life, covering him for his mistakes, treating him with the rough kindness of an older brother. My mother. She does not know where I am. Otto nods slowly. Do not send it. Klaus frowns. Why not? Finish writing it. Keep it in your pocket. If we come back, you give it to her yourself. If we do not come back, there is no point in letting her know where you were. Klaus stares at the older man. He wants to ask the question that has been burning in his mind since the departure orders were announced, but he is afraid of the answer. Otto sees the fear in his eyes. You want to know what I think of this mission? Klaus nods. Otto glances around, making sure no officers are within earshot. I think Admiral Richter does not want to go. I think Berlin is sending us into a trap. But Richter is a good commander. He has survived worse than this. He will do everything in his power to bring us home. And if he cannot, Otto reaches over and places a hand on Klaus's shoulder. Then you swim. No matter what happens, no matter how cold the water, no matter how tired you are, you keep swimming until someone pulls you out or until you cannot swim anymore. Do you understand me? Never stop swimming. The ship's horn sounds, 3 long blasts that echo through the corridors. It is time. 200 miles to the southwest, HMS Duke of York cuts through the heavy Arctic swells her bow, throwing sheets of icy spray across the foredeck. She is a King George V class battleship armed with 10 14-inch guns that can send shells weighing over 700 kilograms, screaming through the air at targets more than 20 kilometers away. In the operations room, Admiral William Crawford studies a chart of the Arctic Ocean. Crawford is 55 years old. He has a face that seems ordinary at first glance, round and pleasant with a neatly trimmed mustache that makes him look more like a country schoolmaster than the commander-in-chief of the home fleet. But those who have served under him know the truth. Behind those mild eyes lies one of the sharpest tactical minds in the Royal Navy, and a burning hatred for one particular German ship. In June of 1940, the Scharnhorst in Nysen ambushed the aircraft carrier Glorious north of Norway. The attack was swift and devastating. The Glorious sank in less than 2 hours. Over 1,500 men went into the water. Only 43 survived. Among the dead was Captain Richard Crawford, William's older brother, the man who had taught him to sail, who had encouraged him to join the Navy, who had been his hero since childhood. For 3 years, the William Crawford has tracked the movements of the Scharnhorst. He has studied her capabilities, her speed, her armament. He has planned a dozen operations to trap her, only to watch her slip away each time. But tonight will be different. On his desk lies a decoded message from Bletchley Park. The Enigma machine, the German encryption device that Berlin believes is unbreakable, has been cracked for years. Every message the Kriegsmarine sends is intercepted and decoded by British intelligence within hours. The message on Crawford's desk reveals everything. Scharnhorst will sortie tonight. Target is convoy JW55B. Estimated arrival and operational area is December 26th, early morning. Crawford has arranged the trap with meticulous precision. To the north, 3 cruisers under Admiral Burnett will escort the convoy and serve as bait. When the Scharnhorst attacks, they will engage and force the German ship to retreat southward. And to the south, hidden in the darkness, the Duke of York and her escorts will be waiting. The trap has 2 jaws, and Richter will sail directly between them. Crawford looks at a photograph on his desk. It shows 2 young men in naval uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. The photograph was taken in 1920, when William was just a midshipman and Richard was already a lieutenant. Brothers, best friends, the kind of bond that death cannot sever, only transform into something more painful. Tonight, Richard. Tonight I settle the debt. The North Cape, December 26, 1943, 0930 hours. At latitude 73 degrees north, there is no sunrise in December. The sky remains black, pierced only by stars and the occasional green shimmer of the aurora borealis. The temperature hovers at -20 degrees Celsius. Waves 4 meters high crash against the Scharnhorst's hull as she plows northward at 28 knots. Klaus stands at his observation post on the starboard side, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the empty darkness. His fingers are numb despite the thick gloves. His breath comes in white clouds that freeze instantly on the wool scarf wrapped around his face. He has not slept in 32 hours. None of them have. Admiral Richter's orders were clear. Maximum vigilance. Watch for any sign of the enemy. On the radar screen in the operations room, a cluster of blips appears to the northeast. The convoy. 19 merchant ships crawling through the Arctic at 8 knots laden with tanks and aircraft and ammunition for the Russian front. The radar officer's voice crackles through the intercom. Contact bearing 025, range 30,000 meters, 19 vessels, 3 escorts. On the bridge, Richter studies the radar display. The escorts appear small, destroyers perhaps, certainly not heavy cruisers, and there is no sign of the home fleet. But something feels wrong. He has survived 2 decades of naval combat by trusting his instincts. And right now, every instinct screams that this is too easy. Increase speed to 30 knots. Prepare main batteries for action. The Scharnhorst surges forward, her engines roaring with power. The great ship slices through the waves, closing the distance to the convoy with terrifying speed. And then the sky explodes into light. Klaus is thrown backward as a star shell bursts directly overhead, bathing the entire ship in harsh white illumination. For a moment, he is blinded. When his vision clears, he sees them. 3 warships bearing down from the north. Not destroyers. Cruisers. Heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns already swinging toward the Scharnhorst. Enemy cruisers bearing 315s. The shout comes from a dozen throats at once. On the bridge, Richter does not hesitate. Hard starboard. All engines ahead, flank. Make smoke. The Scharnhorst heels over as she begins her turn, putting her stern toward the British cruisers. Simultaneously, her aft turret, the one the crew calls Caesar, swings toward the enemy and opens fire. The concussion is tremendous. Klaus feels it in his chest, a physical blow that makes his heart stutter. 3 shells, weighing 330 kilograms each, scream across the water toward the British ships. One finds its mark. Hit on Norfolk. The radar officer's voice is triumphant. Direct hit on their forward superstructure. But the celebration lasts only seconds. British shells begin falling around the Scharnhorst, throwing up massive columns of water that crash back onto the decks like waterfalls. The ship shudders as something strikes her forward mast with a tremendous crash. We have lost the radar forward antenna, destroyed. Keep firing, Richter shouts. Full power to the engines. Make smoke. We will outrun them. The Scharnhorst smoke generators roar to life, pouring thick black clouds from her funnels. Within minutes, she has vanished into the darkness, running south at 30 knots faster than any of the British cruisers can follow. For 2 hours, there is silence. The crew begins to breathe again. Some even smile. The British had set a trap, but the Scharnhorst was too fast, too powerful. They have escaped. Admiral Richter stands alone on the bridge wing, staring into the darkness to the south. He does not smile. He does not relax. They engaged us with cruisers, only cruisers. Where are their battleships? Captain Colby approaches. Perhaps they were not expecting us. Perhaps we caught them off guard. The British knew we were coming. They knew our course, our speed, our target. That does not happen by accident. Their intelligence is far better than ours. Then what do you suggest? Richter is silent for a long moment. His eyes scan the southern horizon, seeing nothing but darkness and stars. I suggest that the cruisers were not the trap. They were bait, meant to push us in a specific direction. Colby's face goes pale. You think there is a second force? I think the British never have just one plan. Maintain maximum vigilance. I want every lookout watching the south, 16-17 hours. The second trap. The star shells come from the south this time. Klaus is at his station when the darkness suddenly turns to daylight. He throws up his arm to shield his eyes, and when he lowers it, he sees something that stops his heart. Rising from the southern horizon is the unmistakable silhouette of a battleship. Massive gun turrets, a towering superstructure, and the distinctive profile of a King George V class vessel, HMS Duke of York. On the bridge, Richter stares at the apparition with the calm of a man who has always known this moment would come. Hard to port, all batteries open fire. But before the Scharnhorst can complete her turn, the Duke of York's main armament speaks. 10 14-inch guns fire simultaneously. The sound is like the end of the world. Klaus sees the muzzle flashes, orange blooms of fire against the black sky, and then the shells are screaming overhead. The first salvo strikes the Scharnhorst with devastating accuracy. A shell punches through the forward turret, the one called Anton, and detonates inside. Klaus feels the deck heave beneath his feet. When he looks forward, he sees flames erupting from the turret's shattered armor. Everyone inside is dead. 40 men gone in an instant. Anton destroyed, the damage reports pour into the bridge like a litany of doom. Bruno hit magazine flooding initiated, fire in the forward superstructure. In moments, the Scharnhorst has lost 2 of her 3 main gun turrets. Only Caesar, the aft turret, remains operational, and she continues to fire, sending shells screaming back at the British battleship. But now the race begins. The Scharnhorst is still the faster ship. Even damaged, even burning, she can outrun the Duke of York. Richter orders maximum speed and the great battleship surges forward, her engines screaming at full power. 30 knots. 31. The distance between the two ships begins to grow. On the Duke of York, Admiral Crawford watches his prey escaping. She is pulling away from us. We cannot match her speed. The radar officer's voice cuts through the tension. Admiral, radar malfunction. The antenna has been knocked out of alignment by our own gun blast. Crawford feels his heart sink. Without radar in the Arctic darkness, they cannot aim their guns. They cannot track their target. The Scharnhorst will escape into the night, and Crawford's 3-year hunt will end in failure. How long to repair, unknown. At least 10 minutes. Possibly more. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, the Scharnhorst will be out of range. Crawford stares at the darkness where his enemy is fleeing. Continue firing. Shoot at her last known position. Perhaps we will get lucky, but everyone knows the truth. Without radar, hitting a target at 20,000 meters in these conditions is nearly impossible. And then Lieutenant Thomas Webb appears on the bridge. Webb is 24 years old, a radar technician from Manchester. The son of a factory machinist, he joined the Navy at 18 and taught himself everything there is to know about the electronic systems that have become the eyes of modern warships. I can fix it, he says, but I have to do it manually, from the mast. Crawford stares at him. The mast, it is 30 meters high, in a blizzard, while our main guns are firing. Webb is already putting on his coat. If I do not try, she gets away. Before anyone can stop him, he is out the door and climbing. The climb. The wind hits Webb like a physical assault the moment he steps outside. Minus 20 degrees. Wind gusting at 60 kilometers per hour. Snow driving horizontally, stinging his exposed skin like needles of ice. He grabs the first rung of the ladder and begins to climb. 5 meters. 10 meters. His hands are going numb despite his gloves. He can feel the cold seeping through his clothing, stealing the warmth from his body 1 degree at a time. Below him, the Duke of York's main guns fire another salvo. The concussion nearly tears him from the mast. He clings desperately as the entire structure that shudders, then forces himself to continue upward. 15 meters. 20. The wind is stronger up here, screaming around him like a living thing. His right glove tears on a jagged piece of metal, and suddenly his bare hand is touching frozen steel. He feels his skin stick to the metal, knows that pulling away will leave flesh behind, but he cannot stop now. 25 meters. 30. He reaches the radar antenna. It has been knocked 15 degrees out of alignment by the repeated shock of the main guns firing. The servo mechanism is frozen solid, locked in place by a coating of ice. Webb pulls off his remaining glove. He needs his bare hands for this. He begins chipping away at the ice, his fingers screaming in agony as they make contact with metal that is 30 degrees below zero. Below him, the guns fire again. The world shakes. He wraps his arms around the mast and holds on until the vibration subsides. Then he begins pushing the antenna back into position. His muscles burn. His lungs feel like they are filled with broken glass. The cold is so intense that he cannot tell if his fingers are still attached to his hands. But the antenna moves. Centimeter by centimeter, degree by degree, it returns to alignment. And suddenly in the radar room 30 meters below, the screen flickers back to life. Contact range 22,000 meters, bearing 120. Crawford spins toward the gunnery officer. Adjust fire quickly. The great turrets of the Duke of York swing toward their target. At this range, in these conditions, it is still nearly an impossible shot. Fire. 10 shells arc into the night sky. They travel 22,000 meters in 30 seconds that feel like 30 years. And then, on the distant horizon, there is a flash of orange light. Hit, direct hit. On the Scharnhorst, Klaus feels the deck heave beneath him as the shell penetrates the ship's upper armor and explodes in boiler room number 1. The effect is immediate and catastrophic. Steam pressure drops to 0. We have lost power. Speed falling. 8 knots, we are down to 8 knots. Richter closes his eyes. He knows what this means. At 8 knots, the Scharnhorst is a sitting target. There is no escape now. He opens his eyes and looks at his officers. Men he has known for only a week. Men who will follow him into death because that is what sailors do. Send a message to Berlin. We will fight to the last shell. Long live Germany. Then he turns back to the battle. Ohio. 2013, Klaus falls silent. James Crawford sits across from him, the recording device forgotten between them on the coffee table. Outside, the snow continues to fall. That shell. Klaus's voice is barely a whisper. The shell that hit our boiler room. It was the last one they were going to fire. Crawford, your grandfather, he was about to give the order to cease fire. And then the radar came back online. Because of Thomas Webb. Klaus nods slowly, a man I hated for 20 years. Because his bravery killed 1,900 of my shipmates. And then I realized something. What I realized that hating him made no sense. He was doing his duty, just as we were doing ours. The enemy is never a person. The enemy is the war itself. James leans forward. What happened next? Klaus looks at the photograph of the Scharnhorst on his wall. Then at the photograph of the Texas ranch. Next came the torpedoes, the sinking, the cold. 47 minutes in water that should have killed me in 15. He pauses. And then came Texas, and Bacon, and Martha, and everything I thought I knew about America turned out to be a lie. He turns back to James. But that is a story for another time. First, you need to understand what it means to watch your ship die, and what it means to keep swimming when everyone around you has stopped. The torpedo attack came from all directions at once. Klaus heard the destroyers before he saw them. The high-pitched whine of their engines cutting through the darkness, the thunder of their guns as they charged through the spray of shells from the Scharnhorst secondary batteries. 4 British destroyers, each carrying 8 torpedoes racing toward the crippled German battleship like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Admiral Richter stood on the bridge watching the attack unfold with the calm of a man who has already accepted his fate. Focus all secondary batteries on the destroyers. Do not let them close the range. But there were too many of them. The Scharnhorst's 15-centimeter guns blazed into the night tracers arcing across the black water, but the destroyers were small and fast, and they came from multiple angles simultaneously. Klaus saw the first torpedo wake cutting through the water, a white line of bubbles racing toward the ship at 40 knots. He opened his mouth to shout a warning, but his voice was lost in the thunder of the guns. The impact threw him off his feet. The explosion seemed to come from inside his own chest. A wall of sound and pressure that lifted him into the air and slammed him against the deck railing. For a moment, everything went white. When his vision cleared, he was lying on his back, staring up at the stars, and the shore beneath him was shuddering like a dying animal. Torpedo hit starboard side. The damage control officer's voice was barely audible over the chaos. Compartments 3 and 4 flooding. Then came the second hit, and the third, and the fourth. Klaus lost count after that. Each explosion blurred into the next, a continuous assault that seemed to go on forever. He felt the ship listing beneath him, tilting to starboard as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the holes in her hull. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard Otto's voice. "Get up, get to the lifeboats." Klaus tried to stand. His legs would not cooperate. The deck was tilting at a steep angle now, and everything that was not bolted down was sliding toward the starboard rail. Ammunition boxes, tools, bodies. Otto grabbed him by the collar and hauled him upright. Move now, they ran, or tried to run. The deck was slick with oil and seawater, and the angle made every step a struggle against gravity. Around them, men were screaming. Some were on fire. Some were crawling toward the rails with shattered limbs. Some were not moving at all. The Caesar turret fired one last salvo. Even now, with the ship dying beneath them, the gunners refused to stop fighting. Klaus felt a surge of pride mixed with despair. This was what it meant to be German. This was what it meant to serve on the Scharnhorst. And then he saw Admiral Richter. The admiral stood on the bridge wing, silhouetted against the flames that were consuming the superstructure. He was not running. He was not shouting orders. He was simply standing there watching his ship die with the calm dignity of a captain who knows his duty. Their eyes met across the chaos, just for a moment. Klaus saw something in the admiral's voice that he would remember for the rest of his life. Not fear, not anger, Just a profound sadness in something that might have been an apology. Then Richter turned away and walked back into the burning bridge. He never came out. The water, Klaus jumped from the port rail. The fall seemed to take forever. He saw the stars wheeling overhead, the flames of the Scharnhorst reflected on the black water, the white foam of the waves rushing up to meet him. Then he hit the surface and the cold erased everything else. It was not like jumping into a cold swimming pool. It was not like anything Klaus had ever experienced. The water was -4 degrees Celsius, cold enough to stop a human heart in seconds, cold enough to freeze the blood in your veins before your brain even registered the sensation. Klaus could not breathe, could not think, could not feel anything except the cold wrapping around him like a fist of ice squeezing the life out of him one cell at a time. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. His arms began moving and pulling him toward the surface. His legs kicked. Instinct took over where conscious thought had failed. He broke the surface, gasping his lungs, burning his heart, hammering against his ribs. Around him, the sea was filled with men. Hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. Dark shapes thrashing in the water, screaming for help, calling out the names of friends and shipmates. The sound was worse than the explosions had been, a chorus of human suffering that seemed to echo across the entire Arctic. Klaus began to swim. He did not know where he was swimming to. There were no lifeboats visible, no ships coming to rescue them, just the endless black water and the fading flames of the Scharnhorst as she rolled onto her side. He swam because Otto had told him to swim. He swam because stopping meant dying. He swam because somewhere deep in his 17-year-old brain, the will to survive burned hotter than the cold that was trying to kill him. 1 stroke, 2 strokes, 3 strokes. His arms were already going numb. The cold was working its way inward, stealing the feeling from his fingers, his hands, his forearms. Soon he would not be able to move them at all. Soon he would sink beneath the surface and join the hundreds of men who were already dying around him. He looked back at the Scharnhorst. She was almost gone now. Her bow had disappeared beneath the waves and her stern was rising into the air, propellers still turning slowly against the stars. In the light of the flames, Klaus could see men still clinging to the hull, sliding down the tilting deck into the water. And then in a final groan of tortured metal, the Scharnhorst slipped beneath the surface and was gone. Klaus was alone. Not truly alone. There were still men in the water around him, still voices crying out in the darkness. But in that moment, watching the ship that had been his home disappear forever, Klaus felt more alone than he had ever felt in his life. He thought about his mother in Hamburg, about the letter in his pocket, the letter she would never read, about his father who had helped build this ship, who would learn someday that his son had gone down with her. And then he thought about Otto's words, never stop swimming. Klaus kept swimming, 47 minutes. Time lost all meaning in the water. Klaus did not know how long he had been swimming. Minutes, hours, the cold had numbed his body so completely that he could no longer tell if his arms and legs were moving. He could only see the stars overhead, feel the swell of the waves lifting him up and dropping him down, hear the sounds of the dying men growing fewer and quieter, as one by one they slipped beneath the surface. He should have died. The human body cannot survive more than 15 minutes in water this cold. The heart slows, the muscles stop responding, the brain shuts down. It is not a painful death, they say. At the end, you simply feel warm and tired, and you close your eyes and let the sea take you. Klaus felt that warmth creeping over him now. It was almost pleasant. A gentle numbness that promised an end to the struggle, an end to the cold, an end to everything. He closed his eyes, and then something hit him in the face. A rope, rough hemp slapping against his cheek with enough force to jolt him back to consciousness. He heard voices, English voices, shouting, "Grab it, grab the rope." Klaus did not think. His hands moved on their own fingers that could no longer feel closing around the lifeline, with the last strength remaining in his frozen body. He felt himself being pulled through the water, felt hands reaching down to grab his arms, his shoulders, his collar, felt the hard edge of a ship's hull scraping against his ribs as they hauled him upward. Then he was lying on a wooden deck, coughing up seawater, and someone was wrapping a blanket around his shaking body. A British sailor looked down at him, young face, concerned eyes. "You are safe now, mate. You are going to be all right." Klaus tried to respond, but his jaw was shaking too hard to form words. He could only lie there staring up at the stars as the reality slowly sank in. He was alive. 47 minutes in water that should have killed him in 15. Later, the doctors would tell him it was a miracle. His youth, his physical condition, the insulating layer of fat that most teenage boys carry without realizing it. Some combination of factors that allowed his body to survive what should have been unsurvivable. But Klaus never believed in miracles. He believed in Otto's words. Never stop swimming. Aboard HMS Duke of York. The British sailors treated him with a kindness he had not expected. They wrapped him in warm blankets. They gave him hot tea, pressing the cup into his numb hands and helping him lift it to his lips. They spoke to him in slow, careful English, asking his name, his rank, his ship. Klaus answered in broken sentences, his German accent thick, his mind still foggy from the cold. Around him, the other survivors were receiving the same treatment. 36 men pulled from the water. 36 out of nearly 2,000. Klaus looked at their faces and saw his own shock reflected back at him. These were men he had known for months. Men he had eaten with, worked with, laughed with. And now they were all that remained of the mighty Scharnhorst's crew. A British officer approached the group. Klaus recognized the insignia of a senior commander. The officer looked at them for a long moment. His face was unreadable. Then he spoke. "Gentlemen, the battle against the Scharnhorst has ended in victory for us. But I want to say something to all of you." He paused, and Klaus saw something unexpected in his eyes. Respect. I hope that if any of you are ever called upon to lead a ship into action against a superior enemy, you will command your vessel as gallantly as the Scharnhorst was commanded today. Klaus did not understand all the words, but he understood the meaning. The man who had just killed his shipmates was honoring them. It made no sense. Everything Klaus had been taught about the enemy, about the British, about the Americans told him that this should not be happening. They should be beaten, humiliated, treated like the defeated soldiers they were. Instead, they were being given hot tea and warm blankets and words of respect. Klaus closed his eyes and felt the world he had known beginning to crack. The transfer. 3 weeks later, Klaus stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the gray coast of Scotland disappear into the mist. He had expected to be taken to a prison camp in England. That was what happened to captured German soldiers. They were interrogated, processed, and locked away until the war ended. But the ship was not heading east toward England. It was heading west. One of the surviving officers, a lieutenant named Brenner, approached Klaus at the rail. "Do you know where we are going?" Klaus shook his head. "America. They are sending us to America." Klaus felt his stomach tighten. America, the land of gangsters and capitalists. The country whose bombs were falling on Hamburg every night. The enemy that his teachers and officers had described as cruel, decadent, morally corrupt. What will they do with us there? Brenner shrugged. Work camps, probably. The Americans need labor for their farms and factories. He tried to smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "At least we will not starve. Americans have more food than they know what to do with." Klaus stared at the empty horizon ahead. He thought about his mother, who had not eaten meat in 2 years because of rationing, about the bread lines in Hamburg, about the hollow cheeks of the children he had seen on the streets before he enlisted. More food than they know what to do with. It sounded like propaganda, another lie designed to make the enemy seem soft and wasteful. He would learn soon enough that it was not a lie at all. Camp Hearn, Texas, February 1944. The truck that brought Klaus to Camp Hearn rattled down a dusty road through endless miles of flat green prairie. Klaus had never seen land like this. In Germany, everything was crowded, dense, built up over centuries. Here the horizon stretched forever in every direction. Cattle grazed in fields that seemed to have no fences. Wooden farmhouses sat alone amid seas of grass, their windmills turning lazily in the warm breeze. And the sky was enormous. So, a dome of blue so vast and deep that Klaus felt he might fall into it if he looked too long. The camp itself was surprisingly ordinary. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by a wire fence. Guard towers at the corners. American soldiers patrolling the perimeter with rifles slung over their shoulders. But as the truck passed through the gate, Klaus noticed something strange. The guards were not pointing their weapons at the prisoners. They were not shouting orders or pushing anyone around. One of them actually nodded at the truck as it passed the way a man might nod at a neighbor. "Welcome to Texas, son." Klaus did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was not hostile. It was almost friendly. The prisoners were unloaded and led to their assigned barracks. Klaus found himself in a long room with 20 bunk beds, a wood stove in the corner, and windows that actually let in sunlight. It was cleaner than any military housing he had seen in Germany. An American sergeant entered the barracks. He was a big man, maybe 45 years old, with the weathered skin and bow-legged walk of someone who had spent his life on horseback. His name tag read Patterson. "All right, listen up. My name is Sergeant Jim Patterson. I am in charge of this barracks. Here are the rules." He spoke slowly, clearly, as if he knew most of them barely understood English. "You work, you get treated fair. You follow orders, you get treated fair. You cause trouble, you get punished. Simple as that. Any questions?" One of the German officers raised his hand. "What is the food ration?" Patterson stared at him for a moment. Then he laughed. "Food ration. Son, this is Texas. You will eat the same food we eat. 3 meals a day, meat, vegetables, bread, coffee. If you are still hungry after that, there is something wrong with your stomach." Klaus exchanged glances with the other prisoners. They did not believe him. It had to be a trick, a way to raise their hopes before crushing them. But the next morning, Klaus discovered that Sergeant Patterson had been telling the truth. The breakfast, the smell woke him before the wake-up call. Klaus had been dreaming about Hamburg, about his mother's kitchen where she used to fry potatoes in the morning before the war, before the rationing, before meat became a memory. He could smell the oil, hear the sizzle, feel the warmth of the stove. Then he opened his eyes and realized the smell was real. It was coming from the mess hall. He followed the other prisoners through the cold morning air, his breath fogging his stomach tight with a mixture of hope and suspicion. The mess hall was a long wooden building with rows of tables and benches. American soldiers and German prisoners sat separately, but they ate in the same room. Klaus got in line. He picked up a metal tray. He moved forward one step at a time until he reached the serving counter, and then he stopped. On the counter in massive metal pans was more food than Klaus had seen in 3 years. Bacon, strips of real bacon, thick and crispy, glistening with fat. The smell alone was enough to make his knees weak. Eggs, fried eggs, 2 per person. The yolks bright yellow like small suns. Toast. White bread, not the gritty gray stuff they had in Germany, but real wheat bread, toasted golden brown and gleaming with butter. And coffee. A huge urn of coffee steam rising from the spout, the rich dark aroma filling the entire room. Klaus did not move. He could not move. He stood there, tray in hand, staring at the food as if it might disappear at any moment. The server, an American private with a bored expression, gestured impatiently. "Move along, buddy. Take what you want." Klaus's hands were shaking as he reached for the bacon. He put 2 strips on his tray. Then when no one stopped him, he added 2 more. He took his eggs, his toast, his coffee. He carried his tray to a table and sat down. For a long moment, he just stared at the plate in front of him. This was for prisoners, for enemies, for the men who had been trying to kill Americans just weeks ago. In Germany, Russian prisoners were worked to death on starvation rations. In Germany, captured soldiers were beaten, humiliated, treated like animals. Here they were given bacon. Klaus picked up a strip and brought it to his mouth. The taste exploded on his tongue. Salt and smoke and fat, crispy on the edges, tender in the middle. It was the most delicious thing he had ever eaten. Better than any meal from his childhood memories. Better than anything he had imagined during the long, hungry years of the war. He began to cry. Not quiet tears, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He sat there at the table in the mess hall of an American prison camp, bacon grease on his fingers, tears streaming down his face, and he wept like a child. The other prisoners looked at him with understanding. Some of them were crying too. An American soldier walked over. Klaus tensed, expecting to be mocked, punished for showing weakness. Instead, the soldier set another strip of bacon on his tray. "Eat up, kid. There is plenty more where that came from." Then he walked away. Klaus ate the bacon. He ate the eggs. He ate the toast. He drank the coffee, real coffee, the first he had tasted in 2 years. And with every bite, every sip, the lies he had been told crumbled a little more. Sergeant Patterson. That evening, Klaus sat on the steps of his barracks watching the sun set over the Texas prairie. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink he had never seen before, colors that seemed impossible too beautiful to be real. Patterson walked over and sat down beside him. For a while, neither of them spoke. The sergeant lit a cigarette and offered one to Klaus, who accepted it with a small nod of thanks. You were on the Scharnhorst. It was not a question. Klaus nodded. Bad business, that. A lot of good men died on both sides. Klaus looked at the sergeant with surprise. He had expected hatred, contempt, not this quiet acknowledgement that German sailors were also good men. Why, Klaus asked, struggling with the English. Why you treat us good? We are enemy. Patterson took a long drag on his cigarette and blew the smoke toward the sunset. Let me tell you something, son. When I heard about what was happening in Europe, about the camps, about the killing, I hated Germans, wanted to kill every last one of you. Klaus said nothing. He had heard rumors about the camps, things he did not want to believe. But then I met some of you, not soldiers, just young men same age as my own son, scared and far from home. And I realized something. He turned to look at Klaus. You are not monsters. You are just kids who got thrown into a war you did not start. Same as our boys, same as the British boys, same as the Russian boys dying by the millions on the Eastern Front. Patterson flicked his cigarette into the dirt. In America, we believe everyone deserves to be treated like a human being. Even our enemies. Maybe especially our enemies. Because how we treat the people who cannot fight back says more about us than anything else. Klaus thought about those words for a long time after Patterson left. He thought about the propaganda posters in Hamburg showing Americans as greedy monsters with hooked noses and bloody hands. He thought about his teachers telling him that the United States was a decadent nation of criminals and degenerates. He thought about bacon for breakfast and coffee and a sergeant who offered him a cigarette and spoke to him like a man instead of a prisoner. Everything he had been taught was wrong. And if the lies about America were wrong, what else had they lied to him about the McAllister Ranch? Spring came to Texas in a burst of wildflowers and warm wind. Klaus was assigned to work at a ranch outside of town. The McAllister spread, they called it 500 acres of cattle and cotton owned by a man named Robert McAllister, though everyone just called him Bobby. Bobby was 55 years old with silver hair, sun-darkened skin, and hands that looked like they were made of leather and oak. He had been a rancher all his life, as his father had been before him and his grandfather before that. He spoke slowly, laughed loudly, and treated his animal better than most men treated their families. The first morning, Bobby looked Klaus up and down with a skeptical eye. Can you ride a horse? No, sir. Can you milk a cow? No, sir. Can you drive a tractor? No, sir. Bobby turned to Sergeant Patterson, who had accompanied Klaus to the ranch. You sent me a boy who cannot do anything useful. Patterson shrugged. He learns fast. Bobby sighed, the sigh of a man who has dealt with too many problems in his life to let one more bother him. All right, Martha will teach him. And that was how Klaus met the woman who would change his life, Martha. She came out of the farmhouse like a vision from another world. Martha McAllister was 18 years old with brown hair that caught the Texas sunlight and turned it to gold. Her eyes were blue, the color of the summer sky, and when she smiled, Klaus forgot how to breathe. Daddy says I am supposed to teach you how to be useful. Klaus nodded, suddenly aware of how shabby his prisoner uniform looked, how dirty his hands were, how inadequate his English was. Martha did not seem to notice. Or if she did not care. First lesson. This is a horse. It will not kill you if you treat it right. She spent the next 3 months teaching him everything. How to ride without falling off, which took 37 attempts before he could stay in the saddle for more than 2 minutes. How to milk a cow, which took 2 weeks before he could do it without getting kicked. How to drive the tractor, which took 3 days and resulted in 2 crashed fences and 1 very angry chicken coop. And how to speak English. Every evening after the work was done, they sat on the porch of the farmhouse and practiced. She would point at things and say the words. Horse, fence, sky, star. He would repeat them, mangling the pronunciation until she laughed and corrected him. Water, she said. Not Vader. Water. Better. Now try this one. The Z. No. The put your tongue between your teeth, Klaus tried. The sound that came out was somewhere between a snake hiss and a sneeze. Martha burst out laughing. Klaus felt his face turn red. I am sorry, she said, still giggling. You just look so serious, like it was life or death. For me, Klaus said carefully, every word is life or death. If I cannot speak, I cannot be understood. If I cannot be understood, I am nothing. Martha stopped laughing. She looked at him with those blue eyes, and Klaus saw something shift in her expression. You are not nothing, she said softly. You are Klaus, and you are doing fine. That night, lying in his bunk at Camp Hearn, Klaus stared at the ceiling and admitted to himself what he had known for weeks. He was falling in love. The summer of 1944. The months passed like a dream. Klaus worked at the McAllister Ranch 6 days a week, learning the rhythms of Texas life. He learned to rope cattle, sort of. He learned to fix fences without hitting his thumb with the hammer, mostly. He learned to endure the brutal summer heat, which made the Arctic cold seem almost pleasant by comparison. And every day he saw Martha. They talked about everything. About his childhood in Hamburg, about her mother who had died when she was 10, about the war that seemed so far away from this peaceful corner of Texas. She taught him about America, not the America of the propaganda films, but the real America. A country of contradictions and complexities of terrible history and profound ideals of people who could be cruel and kind in equal measure. My mother was German, Martha told him one evening. They were sitting on the fence watching the sunset, their shoulders almost touching. She came here after the last war in 1920. She met my father at a dance in town. He did not care that she was German. He only cared that she could dance. Klaus looked at her. Your mother was German, from Bavaria. She used to sing me German lullabies when I was small. I still remember some of the words. She hummed a few bars of a song Klaus recognized from his own childhood. The sound made his chest ache. She told me something before she died, Martha continued. She said, never hate a whole people. Hate the war. Hate the cruelty, but never hate the people. Because every enemy can become a friend, and every friend can become family. Klaus looked at Martha. In the fading light, her hair glowed like copper, and her eyes held depths he wanted to explore for the rest of his life. He knew he should not feel this way. He was a prisoner. She was the daughter of his employer. The war was still raging across the ocean. There were 1,000 reasons why this could never work, but love does not listen to reasons. Ohio, 2013. Klaus fell silent. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. James Crawford sat forward in his chair. What happened next with Martha? Klaus smiled, but there was sadness in it. Her father found out. Someone in town saw us together, and they told Bobby. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the ranch house frozen in time. Bobby was furious. He called me to his office and told me I was no longer welcome at his ranch. He said if I ever came near his daughter again, he would have me sent to a different camp somewhere far away. And Martha, she cried. She said she loved me. She said she would wait for me no matter how long the war lasted. Klaus shook his head slowly. I believed her, and I was right to believe. But I did not know then that it would take 5 years before I saw her again, or that it would take a letter from your grandfather to make it possible. James frowned. My grandfather. What did he have to do with it? Klaus looked at him with ancient eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too much and remembered everything. That is a story for the final chapter, James Crawford. The story of how the man who killed my shipmates became the man who saved my future, and how a girl from Texas taught a German prisoner that there is no such thing as an enemy who cannot become family. He reached for his cup of tea with trembling hands. But first you need to understand what happened in 1945, when the war ended, when I went home to a country in ruins, and when I discovered that the hardest journey was not surviving the Arctic. It was finding my way back to the only place that had ever felt like home. The war ended on a Tuesday. Klaus learned about the German surrender, not from an official announcement, but from the cheering of the American guards. He was lying in his bunk at Camp Hearn, staring at the ceiling, as he had done every night for the past year, thinking about Martha. Then the shouting started. At first he thought there had been an escape attempt. He sat up heart-pounding, expecting to hear gunfire. Instead, he heard laughter. American soldiers were running between the barracks, pounding on doors, yelling words he could barely understand through their excitement. The war is over. Germany surrendered. It is finished. Klaus sat very still. Around him, the other prisoners were waking up, rubbing their eyes, asking each other what was happening. Some understood English better than others, and the news spread through the barracks like fire through dry grass. Finished. The war was finished. Klaus waited to feel something. Relief, perhaps. Joy. Grief for the millions who had died. But there was only a strange emptiness, a hollow space where emotion should have been. He walked outside. The Texas night was warm and thick with the smell of grass and cattle. Above him, the stars burned bright and indifferent, the same stars that had watched the Scharnhorst sink beneath the Arctic waves, the same stars that had witnessed every battle and every death of the past 6 years. Germany had lost. Everything Klaus had been raised to believe, in everything he had been taught, was right and true and worth dying for had been proven wrong. The fatherland was in ruins. The leaders he had trusted were dead or captured. The future he had imagined, the triumphant Germany that would dominate Europe for 1,000 years, had been crushed beneath the boots of American and British and Russian soldiers. And Klaus felt nothing. No, that was not quite true. He felt something, a tiny spark buried deep beneath the numbness. He felt free, the aftermath. The weeks after the surrender were strange and uncertain. The prisoners remained at Camp Hearn while the authorities figured out what to do with them. Some wanted to go home immediately, desperate to find out if their families had survived the bombing campaigns that had reduced German cities to rubble. Others wanted to stay in America, terrified of what awaited them in a defeated and occupied nation. Klaus did not know what he wanted. He thought about his parents in Hamburg. He had received no letters from them in over a year. The last news he had was from early 1944, before the firebombing, before the collapse, before everything. They could be dead. They could be alone. There was no way to know. And he thought about Martha. Bobby McAllister had forbidden him from returning to the ranch. Klaus had not seen her in 9 months, had not spoken to her since that terrible day when Bobby had stood red-faced and shouting in his office, telling Klaus that he was no longer welcome, that he should stay away from his daughter if he knew what was good for him. But Martha had made him a promise. She had said she would wait. Did she still mean it? Now that the war was over, now that Klaus was no longer a mysterious prisoner, but simply a defeated German with no money and no future, would she still want him? Sergeant Patterson found Klaus sitting alone behind the barracks one evening, watching the sun set over the prairie. "You look like a man with too many thoughts." Klaus nodded slowly. "I do not know what to do." Patterson sat down beside him, groaning slightly as his knees protested. "Neither do most people, son. That is the secret of life. We are all just making it up as we go along." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to black. "There is something you should know," Patterson said finally. "Someone has been asking about you." Klaus looked at him sharply. Patterson reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. This came from the camp commander. Official correspondence from England. Klaus took the envelope with trembling hands. The paper was crisp and white, stamped with military insignia he did not recognize. He opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The letter was written in English, but the words were simple enough that Klaus could understand most of them. "Dear Mr. Hoffman, I am writing to inform you that I have submitted a request to the appropriate authorities regarding your potential immigration to the United States following your repatriation to Germany. Should you wish to return to America after the war, I am prepared to serve as your sponsor. I understand this may seem unusual given the circumstances of our acquaintance, but I believe that men who have demonstrated courage and honor in battle deserve the opportunity to build new lives in peace. If you are interested in this possibility, please respond through the channels indicated below. Respectfully, Admiral William Crawford, Royal Navy." Klaus read the letter 3 times before the words made sense. Crawford, the man who had commanded the ship that sank the Scharnhorst, the man whose guns had killed nearly 2,000 of Klaus's shipmates, the man whose brother had died at the hands of Klaus's own ship years before. That man wanted to sponsor Klaus's immigration to America. "I do not understand," Klaus whispered. "Why would he do this?" Patterson shrugged. "I do not know the Admiral personally, but I have heard things. He is not the kind of man who holds grudges. He is the kind of man who believes that once a war is over, it should stay over." Klaus stared at the letter in his hands. The enemy who had killed his friends now wanted to help him start a new life. Nothing made sense anymore. Germany, 1946. Klaus returned to Hamburg in the spring of 1946. The city he remembered no longer existed. Where there had been streets and houses and shops, there were now only mountains of rubble. Entire neighborhoods had been erased by Allied bombing, reduced to fields of broken brick and twisted metal. The people who walked through these ruins moved like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, searching for food and shelter, and some reason to keep living. Klaus found his parents in a basement apartment near the harbor. His mother wept when she saw him. His father, always stoic, simply gripped his hand and held it for a long time without speaking. They had survived. Barely. The house Klaus had grown up in was gone, destroyed in the firestorm of 1943. They had lost everything except each other. For 2 years, Klaus stayed in Hamburg. He worked whatever jobs he could find, hauling rubble, repairing buildings, doing the backbreaking labor of reconstruction. The money was worthless, the food was scarce, and every day was a struggle simply to survive. But every night Klaus dreamed of Texas. He dreamed of blue skies and green prairies. He dreamed of bacon sizzling in a pan and coffee steaming in a cup. He dreamed of Martha's laugh and Martha's eyes and the way she had looked at him in the fading light of a summer evening. He had written to her using the address Patterson had given him before he left. He had told her he was alive, that he was in Germany, that he still loved her. He had asked if she still wanted him to come back. For 6 months there was no reply. Klaus told himself it meant nothing. The mail was unreliable. Letters got lost. Perhaps she had never received his message. But deep down he feared the worst. 2 years was a long time. Martha was young and beautiful and surrounded by American men who were not defeated enemies from a ruined country. Why would she wait for him? Then, in the autumn of 1947, a letter arrived. Klaus recognized the handwriting immediately. He tore open the envelope with shaking hands. "Dear Klaus, I am sorry it took so long to write back. Your letter was lost for months before it finally reached me. When I read it, I cried for 3 hours. I never stopped waiting. I never stopped hoping. Every night I looked at the stars and wondered if you were looking at the same ones, Buzz. Daddy is still angry. He says I am foolish to love a German. But I do not care what he thinks. I know who you are. I know the man you became in those months on the ranch, and I know that man is worth waiting for. There is a way for you to come back. I have been asking questions, talking to lawyers, trying to find a path. And I discovered something. Someone has already offered to sponsor you. An admiral from England. His name is Crawford. I do not know why he would do this. But I spoke with Sergeant Patterson and he says the offer is real. If you want to come back to America, you can. Please come back, Klaus. Please come home. I love you." Martha Klaus read the letter until he had memorized every word. Then he sat down and wrote 2 letters of his own. The first was to Martha, telling her he would come as soon as he could. The second was to Admiral William Crawford, accepting his offer. The return, Klaus arrived in New York Harbor on a gray morning in March of 1950. He stood at the rail of the ship as it passed the Statue of Liberty, watching the great copper figure emerge from the mist. Around him, other passengers were cheering, weeping, pointing at the skyline of Manhattan rising in the distance. Many of them were refugees like him, people who had lost everything in the war and were now seeking a new beginning in a new world. Klaus did not cheer. He was too busy scanning the crowd on the dock below, searching for a face he had not seen in 5 years. Then he saw her. Martha stood at the front of the crowd wearing a blue dress that matched her eyes. Her hair was longer now, pinned up in the style of the time, and she was thinner than he remembered. But her smile was the same, that smile that had haunted his dreams through 2 years of war and 4 years of aftermath. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. For a long second, they simply looked at each other across the distance. 2 people who had been torn apart by the largest war in human history, reunited on a crowded dock in a city that neither of them had ever seen. Then Klaus was running down the gangway, pushing through the crowd, not caring who he shoved aside. Martha was running too, her heels clicking on the concrete, her arms already reaching for him. They collided in the middle of the dock. Klaus wrapped his arms around her and held her so tight he was afraid he might break her. She was crying into his shoulder, saying his name over and over, and he realized that he was crying too. "You came back," she whispered. "You actually came back. I promised I would." Klaus pulled back just far enough to look at her face. "I would have crossed oceans for you, Martha. I would have crossed continents. There is nothing on this earth that could have kept me away." She laughed through her tears. "You did cross an ocean, you fool." Then she kissed him, and for a moment the entire world disappeared. There was only Martha and the taste of her lips and the feeling that after everything he had been through, He had finally found his way home. The wedding, they were married 1 month later in a small church outside of Cleveland. Klaus had chosen Ohio because it was far from Texas, far from Bobby McAllister and the memories of the war. He wanted to build a new life with Martha, not spend his days haunted by the ghost of who he used to be. The ceremony was simple. A few friends they had made in the weeks since Klaus's arrival, Sergeant Patterson, who had traveled north for the occasion, a handful of Martha's relatives who had accepted her choice despite their reservations. Bobby McAllister did not attend, but 3 days before the wedding, a letter arrived at their small apartment. Martha recognized her father's handwriting and hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single piece of paper with a few lines scrawled in Bobby's cramped script. "You have proven me wrong. Take care of my daughter." There was no signature, no expression of love or blessing. But Martha held that letter to her chest and cried for an hour. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. The years between Klaus and Martha built their life together in Ohio. He found work at a machine shop in Toledo, starting as a floor sweeper and working his way up to machinist. She became a school teacher, spending her days with children who knew nothing of war or hatred, teaching them to read and write and dream of the future. They bought a small house in Millbury in 1955. White siding, green shutters, a backyard big enough for the vegetable garden Martha insisted on planting. It was not a grand house, not a wealthy house, but it was theirs. 2 children came. A son named Thomas, after the radar operator who had climbed the mast in the Arctic storm. A daughter named Anna, after Klaus's mother, who had died in 1952 without ever seeing America. Klaus became an American citizen in 1958. He stood in a courtroom with 40 other immigrants, raised his right hand, and swore allegiance to the flag of his adopted country. Martha sat in the gallery crying quietly, clutching the hands of their children. He never forgot that he was German. He never forgot the Scharnhorst or the men who died in the Arctic. But he learned to carry those memories without being crushed by them. He learned to honor the dead by living well. And through all those years, he never forgot the man who had made it possible. The letter, 1975. The telephone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in September. Klaus was in his workshop repairing a broken radio when Martha called him inside. Her face was pale. There was a lawyer on the phone, from England. Klaus took the receiver with a growing sense of dread. "Mr. Hoffman, my name is James Thornton. I am an attorney representing the estate of Admiral William Crawford." Klaus felt his heart stop. The Admiral passed away last week. In his will, he left specific instructions that a letter be delivered to you following his death. I am calling to confirm your address so that we may send it. Klaus gave the address mechanically. He thanked the lawyer. He hung up the phone. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a very long time. Crawford was dead. The man who had sunk the Scharnhorst. The man who had sponsored Klaus's immigration to America. The man Klaus had never met. Never spoken to, never understood, dead. The letter arrived 1 week later. Klaus held the envelope in his hands, feeling the weight of it, studying the British stamps and the official seals. He thought about not opening it. Some part of him wanted to leave the mystery intact, to never know why Crawford had done what he had done. But he knew he owed the Admiral more than that. He opened the envelope. "Dear Mr. Hoffman, if you are reading this letter, am no longer among the living. I have asked my solicitors to ensure this reaches you because there are things I need you to know, things I could never bring myself to say while I was alive. On Christmas night in 1943, I commanded the task force that sank the Scharnhorst. I did so willingly, even eagerly. The Scharnhorst had killed my brother Richard 4 years earlier, and I wanted revenge. When I watched your ship go down, I felt satisfaction. I felt that justice had been done. But then we pulled your survivors from the water. I stood on the deck of the Duke of York and watched 36 young men being wrapped in blankets and given hot tea, and I realized something that changed me forever. These were not monsters. These were not the evil enemy I had been taught to hate. They were frightened boys, half frozen, grieving for their lost comrades. They were no different from our own sailors who had died in those same waters. That night I began to understand that revenge is a poison. It does not heal the wounds of the past. It only creates new wounds for the future. In the years after the war, I tried to make amends in whatever small ways I could. I visited the families of German officers who had died, including the family of Admiral Richter. I sponsored 6 Scharnhorst survivors for immigration to Allied countries. You were one of them. I do not expect your forgiveness. I am not sure I deserve it. I gave the orders that killed nearly 2,000 of your shipmates, and no amount of good deeds can change that fact. But I want you to know that I have thought about you often over the years. I have hoped that you found happiness in America. I have hoped that you were able to build a life worth living. And I want you to know this, I never considered you my enemy. Not after that night. You were a sailor who served his country with courage, just as my brother did. The war made us adversaries. But the war is over now, and it has been over for a long time. Live well, Mr. Hoffman. That is all any of us can do, respectfully. William Crawford Klaus read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the table. Martha sat down across from him. She had been watching in silence. What did he say? Klaus looked at her with eyes that were suddenly very tired and very old. He said he was sorry. He said he hoped I had found happiness. He said he never considered me his enemy. Martha reached across the table and took his hands. Are you all right? Klaus thought about the question for a long time. I spent 30 years hating that man. Every time I dreamed about the Arctic, every time I remembered the cold and the screaming and the ship going down, I blamed him. He became the face of everything I had lost. He looked down at the letter, and now I discover that he spent those same 30 years trying to make amends, that he carried the same guilt, I carried the same pain, that he thought about me and hoped I was happy. Klaus shook his head slowly. All those years of hatred, and it was for nothing. He was not my enemy. He never was. Martha squeezed his hands, then let it go. The hatred, the anger, all of it. Let it go. Klaus looked at his wife, the Texas girl who had taught him to ride horses and speak English. The woman who had waited 5 years for a German prisoner to come back to her. The love of his life. He let out a long breath, and he let it go. Ohio, December 2013. The snow has stopped falling outside the window of the house on Maple Street. Klaus sits in his worn leather armchair, the letter from Crawford still in his hands after nearly 40 years. Across from him, James Crawford, the Admiral's grandson, waits in silence. I never met your grandfather. Klaus's voice is soft-tired, the voice of a man who has told a very long story and is nearing its end. I never thanked him for what he did. I never told him that I forgave him. And now it is too late, James leans forward. But you did forgive him. Eventually, Klaus nods slowly. Not at first. For many years, I told myself that I had moved past it, that the hatred was gone. But it was still there, buried deep. It came out in my dreams, in my silences, in the way I would sometimes stare at the wall and see nothing but ice and fire. He looks at the letter. But after I read this, something changed. I realized that Crawford and I were the same. 2 men trapped on opposite sides of a war. We did not start doing our duty, carrying guilt for things we could not have prevented. He lost his brother. I lost my shipmates. We both lost years of our lives to anger and sorrow. Klaus sets the letter down on the table between them. That was when I truly forgave him, not because he asked for it, not because he deserved it, but because I finally understood that forgiveness is not a gift you give to someone else. It is a gift you give to yourself. James is quiet for a moment. Then he reaches into his briefcase and pulls out a small object wrapped in cloth. My grandfather kept this for 70 years. In his will, he asked that I find someone from the Scharnhorst and return it to them. He unwraps the cloth. Inside is a metal badge tarnished with age, but still recognizable. The emblem of the Scharnhorst, a shield with an anchor, and the ship's name inscribed below. Klaus takes the badge with trembling hands. Where did he get this? One of your survivors gave it to him. On the deck of the Duke of York, just before the man died of hypothermia. He said he wanted the Admiral to have it to remember them by. Klaus stares at the badge. His eyes are filling with tears. This belonged to Otto Weber. He was my friend. He was the one who told me to never stop swimming. James nods. My grandfather kept it on his desk for the rest of his life. He said it reminded him that every enemy is also a human being. Klaus clutches the badge to his chest. The tears are flowing freely now, an old man weeping for a friend who died 70 years ago in the frozen waters of the Arctic. James stands. He walks around the table and places a hand on Klaus's shoulder. On behalf of my grandfather, on behalf of the crew of HMS Duke of York, I want to say something to you. Klaus looks up. We are sorry for your loss. We are grateful for your service, and we are honored to have known you even if only through the stories that have been passed down. He pauses. You are not our enemy, Mr. Hoffman. You never were. Klaus rises slowly from his chair. He stands facing James Crawford, the grandson of the man who sank his ship, the representative of a nation that was once his adversary. And then he extends his hand. James takes it. Two men stand in a small house in Ohio, holding hands across 70 years of history. One German, one British. Both American now in spirit, if not in birth. Both carrying the weight of a war that shaped their families forever. Thank you, Klaus says. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the badge. And thank you for telling me that your grandfather thought of me. It means more than you can know. James nods. It has been an honor, Mr. Hoffman. A true honor. Epilogue. 1 week later. Klaus Hoffman died peacefully in his sleep on a Thursday morning, 1 week after James Crawford's visit. He was 87 years old. He had lived in America for 63 years. He had raised 2 children, spoiled 4 grandchildren, and loved 1 woman for the whole of his adult life. The funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Millbury, the same church where he and Martha had worshipped every Sunday for decades. The pews were filled with neighbors, friends, former co-workers, people who had known Klaus as the quiet German man with the thick accent and the kind smile. James Crawford flew from London to attend. He sat in the front row next to Klaus's children and grandchildren and listened as the pastor spoke about a life well lived. At the graveside, James stepped forward to lay a wreath. The ribbon bore the colors of 3 flags intertwined the Union, Jack the German tricolor and the Stars and Stripes. On the ribbon were printed the words from the crew of HMS Duke of York, "To a gallant sailor, rest in peace." The headstone, which Klaus had chosen years before, bore a simple inscription, Klaus Hoffman, 1926 to 2013. I was an enemy. I became a prisoner. I was forgiven. I became an American. And I learned that there is no enemy who cannot become a friend. Beside his name, the stone bore another, Martha McAllister Hoffman, 1925 to 2011, the Texas girl who taught a German prisoner to ride horses, and who taught him that love has no borders. The final word on Christmas night in 1943, 1,932 men died in the frozen waters of the Arctic. They were German sailors serving aboard the battleship Scharnhorst. They were young and old, brave and frightened, true believers and reluctant conscripts. They had families waiting for them at home. They had dreams that would never be fulfilled. Their ship was sunk by the British Royal Navy in the Battle of the North Cape. Only 36 survived. For decades, this story was remembered only as a footnote in the history of the Second World War. A German defeat, a British victory, statistics in a book that few people ever read. But the true story was never about ships or guns or naval tactics. The true story was about what happened after. It was about Admiral William Crawford, who spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for the deaths he had caused, who visited the families of his enemies and offered them comfort, who sponsored the immigration of 6 Scharnhorst survivors because he believed they deserved a second chance. It was about Sergeant Jim Patterson, who treated his prisoners like human beings, because he understood that the measure of a nation is how it treats those who cannot fight back. It was about Bobby McAllister, who learned to accept a former enemy as his son-in-law because his daughter loved him. It was about Martha, who waited 5 years for a German prisoner to come back to her because she believed that love is stronger than war. And it was about Klaus Hoffman, a 17-year-old boy who survived 47 minutes in water that should have killed him at 15. A prisoner of war who discovered that everything he had been taught about America was a lie. A man who spent 30 years learning to forgive the enemy who had taken so much from him. Klaus's story is not unique. Across the world, in every country that fought in the Second World War, there are stories like his. Stories of enemies who became friends. Stories of hatred that transformed into understanding. Stories of people who chose reconciliation over revenge. These stories matter. They matter because they remind us that war is not destiny, that the divisions between nations and peoples are not permanent, that even the deepest wounds can heal given enough time and enough courage. Klaus Hoffman learned this lesson in a prison camp in Texas, eating bacon for breakfast, while guards who could have treated him with cruelty chose kindness instead. He carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life. And now with his passing, it falls to us to carry it forward. Remember the Scharnhorst. Remember the men who died. Remember the men who survived. But most of all, remember this: there is no enemy who cannot become a friend. There is no hatred so deep that it cannot be overcome. And there is no darkness so complete that a single act of kindness cannot light the way forward. That is the lesson of Klaus Hoffmann's life. That is the legacy of the greatest generation. And that is the story we must never forget.